The ridge held its breath, the way it always did in the hour before full dark, when the light turned the color of old brass and the wind stopped pretending it had anywhere else to be. She stood at the mouth of a shaft that was not supposed to exist anymore. Not on any company map, not in any surveyor's log, not in the memory of anyone still willing to speak of it in town. $9 sat folded in the pocket of her skirt, counted out that morning by hands that had not looked at her while they counted. In her right hand she carried a hammer, iron-headed, its handle worn smooth in a grip that was not her own, though her palm had long since learned its shape. She was 17 years old, and she had walked into these mountains with almost nothing, and she was about to find something that men had killed to keep buried. The stone in front of her had a scar on it, a long, pale gouge where iron had struck rock at an angle no falling debris could ever produce, a mark made by a hand, made with purpose, made by someone standing exactly where she was standing now. She had seen 10,000 marks like it in her life, taught to read them before she was old enough to understand what they cost. This one was different, only in what it meant. This one was a door. She did not open it that evening. She only stood there, the hammer heavy and familiar against her leg, and let the last of the light slide off the rock like water off a roof, and understood, the way her father had taught her to understand ground before it moved, that everything about to happen to her had already been decided by men who thought the mountain would keep their secret longer than a girl's patience could last. They were wrong about that. They had been wrong about it for 22 years. What she found, sealed inside that ridge, would take her name off the list of people this town simply tolerated and put it onto a claim deed, a company ledger, and eventually a sign nailed above a mine office that did not exist yet on the evening she stood there with $9 and a dead man's hammer. But that is getting ahead of the story, and this is not a story that deserves to be rushed. Every good vein runs deeper than the first strike, and this one runs all the way back to a small house at the edge of a mining camp, to a man who taught his daughter to read stone, the way other fathers taught daughters to read scripture, and to a Tuesday morning some years later when a family closed an account and thought that was the end of her. It was not the end of her. It was barely the beginning. Settle in, if you have the time. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and how far you've traveled to hear an old story about a ridge, a hammer, and the 5 men the mountain finally let go. Before the ridge took her father, before the account closed and the $9 were counted twice to make sure no one had erred in her favor, there was simply a house. It stood at the edge of a mining camp where the wind came down off the peaks smelling of pine pitch and cold iron, and where the sound of stamp mills 3 miles off carried through the walls at night like something breathing in its sleep. She was born in that house, or near enough to it, and she grew up knowing the particular hush that settles over a mining family in autumn, when the crews are pushing hard, before the snow closes the passes, and every supper is eaten a little too fast, a little too quiet, because the men are tired in a way that sleep does not fix. Her father was not a miner by trade. He was a surveyor, the man companies sent for when they needed to know whether a slope would hold or a shaft would flood, and he carried himself with the particular carefulness of someone who had seen what happens when other men guess instead of measure. He kept his boots by the door, and his charts rolled in tin tubes along the wall, and in the evenings, when the light came low and orange through the one good window, he would sit her down at the table with a chunk of raw stone between them and teach her to read it the way another man might teach his child to read a hymnal. He taught her the difference between rock that had settled honestly over 1,000 years and rock that had been disturbed and left to heal wrong, the kind that looked solid to an untrained eye and would open like a mouth under the weight of a man's boot. He taught her to run her palm along a timber support and feel for the soft give of wrought before it showed itself in color. He taught her that water left marks on stone the way grief left marks on a face, if you knew where to look, and that a shaft's angle told you more about the men who dug it than anything they might have written down. She did not think of it, then, as an inheritance. It was simply what her father did with his evenings instead of drinking or complaining, and what she did instead of sitting idle, and if she loved those hours it was because they belonged only to the two of them, in a house with thin walls and a stove that never quite warmed the far corner, in a life that seemed, at 17, to stretch out ahead of her the way the ridge itself did, vast, familiar, unremarkable, and entirely certain to still be there tomorrow. She was wrong about that last part. Tomorrow, as it turned out, was already narrowing toward a specific morning in a specific month, though nothing in the quiet of that house gave her any warning of it. There was an outcrop half a mile behind the house, a shelf of gray sandstone shouldering up through the sagebrush like the spine of something buried and mostly forgotten, and it was there, on Sunday afternoons when the mind did not run, that her father did his real teaching. He would crouch at its base with his hat pushed back and his knees cracking the way they always did by then, and he would set her hand flat against the rock and ask her what she felt before he ever asked her what she saw. Cold in the morning, warmer by noon, he said, but that was weather, and weather lied. What did not lie was the grain, the way the layers ran level in one place and canted sharply in another, tilted by some violence that had happened before either of them or their grandfathers had names. He showed her how to sight along a bedding plane with 2 fingers held out like a rifle stock, how a fault line would sometimes announce itself only in a faint discoloration, a rust-colored seam no wider than a knife blade, and how that seam could mean water or could mean nothing, and how the only way to know the difference was to have looked at 1,000 seams before it. He made her walk the same 40 feet of outcrop a dozen times, across a dozen weeks, in rain and in the flat white light of August, until she stopped seeing rock at all and started seeing a kind of sentence, one layer answering another, the way a question answers a statement. He never called it geology, he called it paying attention, and he said the words the way other fathers might have said prayer or supper, as though it were simply one of the ordinary disciplines a life required. He taught her timber the same patient way, dragging her along to the played-out shafts nobody minded a girl wandering into, showing her how a support post gone soft would sound different under a knuckle, a duller note, almost apologetic, and how the good wood rang back at you, sharp and certain. He taught her to smell rot before her eyes found it, a sweetish, cellar smell that clung to failing pine, long before the pine itself gave way. She did not ask him why any of it mattered, not then. It was simply the shape their evenings took, the 2 of them out past the last fence line while the light went copper over the ridge, and she understood only much later, in a season she could not yet see coming, that he had not been teaching her a trade at all. He had been teaching her how to read the ground the way another man might teach a daughter to read scripture, so that whatever else was taken from her, she would always have a way of asking the earth a question and trusting, at least a little, its answer. There was one evening, though, that stood apart from all the others, and she would return to it later the way a person returns to a photograph, turning it over to see if the back holds a date. They had walked farther than usual that night, up past the 3rd bench where the old company had cut its first exploratory drift, and he had stopped there with his lantern low, not lit, just carried, and told her a story instead of a lesson. He said that in the year 1871, before she was born, before he had even come to that country, 5 men had gone up onto the north face of the ridge to follow a vein that had shown promising color at the grass roots. He said their names had been common enough once, ordinary men with ordinary debts, and that they had gone up in the last cold weeks of winter, when the ground was hard enough to hold a man's weight, and nobody thought twice about frost heave loosening what summer thaw had already weakened. He said the mountain had taken them whole, shaft and men together, in a single collapse that no one heard, because the wind that week had been loud enough to swallow the sound of the world ending for 5 people at once. No bodies had ever come down, he told her. No tools, no boots, no scrap of a coat sleeve caught on brush. The company of that time had sent up a crew to dig, briefly, and then had stopped, and the official reason given was the danger of further collapse, though he said this last part slowly. The way he said things, he did not entirely believe, but had decided not to argue with the dead about. She had asked him, the way a child asks about ghost stories, whether he thought the men were still up there, and he had said only that the mountain did not give things back until it was finished with them, which she took at the time for a father's way of ending a story before it frightened his daughter past sleeping. He had not lit the lantern that whole conversation. She remembered that specifically, the dark settling around them while he spoke, his voice low and unhurried, the way it always was when he was teaching her something. Though she did not yet understand, this had been a lesson too, that a mountain kept its accounts closed until someone patient enough came to open them. She thought of it rarely after that, the way a person thinks rarely of a locked door in a house they do not live in. It surfaced now and again, in the particular hush of the ridge at dusk, in the way certain miners crossed themselves passing the north face. In her father's own refusal, she noticed only once, to survey that section of ground for the company, though they had asked him twice. She did not connect these things at the time. She only filed them away, the way she filed away the sound of good timber and bad, without knowing which discipline her life would eventually call upon, or how soon, or how completely. The hammer came to her hand the way most things in that household came to her, without ceremony, without a moment set aside to mark it as significant. He simply held it out to her one morning on a face of gray granite above the second cut, the head of it worn smooth and dark from handling, the haft replaced twice that she knew of, and said that a hammer left an argument on stone the same way a signature left an argument on paper, and that she had better learn to read both before she trusted either. She did not understand him at first. She thought he meant only the obvious thing, the crude fact of a mark being present or absent. He corrected this within the hour, crouching at a seam of rock and tracing with one blunt finger the difference between a strike made in confidence and a strike made in doubt, the first shallow and even, laid down by a man who knew exactly where the rock wanted to break, the second deeper and crooked, gouged by a man arguing with stone that would not agree with him. He told her every man who had ever swung a hammer against rock left something of himself in the mark, whether he intended to or not, his patience or his hurry, his skill or his fear, the particular cant of his wrist, the particular weight he favored. A trained eye, he said, could no more mistake one miner's strike for another's than a banker could mistake one man's signature for his neighbor's. He set her to practicing on scrapstone through that whole autumn, striking and restriking until her palms blistered and her wrists ached in a way that woke her at night, and he corrected nothing about her form except to insist she strike the same way each time, so that her own signature would become legible even to her. He never called it a gift, not once, though she came in time to understand that this was precisely what it was, not the iron itself, which was common enough and could be bought at any hardware counter in the territory, but the discipline of eye and memory he was building around it, patiently, the way a man builds a wall he expects to outlast him. He kept the hammer itself afterward, using it daily at the cuts and the shoring lines, and only spoke of it as hers in the offhand way a man speaks of something he does not expect to need to formalize, saying once, almost carelessly, that when his hand tired of it, the tool would know hers well enough by then to do the same work without complaint. She did not think much of that remark at the time, filing it away with the rest, not yet understanding that a mountain full of silent men could someday be made to speak again through nothing grander than the particular angle a blistered girl's wrist had learned, one gray autumn, to strike and strike and strike until the strike was hers alone. The morning he left for the last time was the 9th of October, and she would remember it in fragments, the way one remembers a room by lightning flashes rather than by daylight, the kettle just beginning to sing on the stove, the frost on the inside of the window, not yet burned off by the sun, the particular gray of a sky that had not decided whether it meant to rain. He ate 2 eggs and the heel of yesterday's bread, standing rather than sitting, the way he always did on survey mornings, as though sitting too long might let the day get ahead of him. He wore the coat with the torn elbow that she had meant to mend, and had not, and she would carry that unmended tear afterward, like a debt she owed, and could never pay, though he himself had said nothing of it, had shrugged it on without comment, the way a man puts on a coat he has worn 100 mornings before. He kissed the top of her head, which he did not always do, and told her to mind the fire and mind her arithmetic, in that order, and said he would be back by supper, because the seam up on the north ridge only needed a look, a formality, he called it, the company wanting his signature on ground the foreman had already half decided was sound. He took the hammer with him, as he always did, tucked through his belt where it rode against his hip with a small metallic patience, and he took his chalk and his folding rule and nothing else, because a formality did not require more than that. The weather turned by mid-afternoon, a wind coming down off the peaks that smelled of iron and wet stone, and she would learn later, from men who did not want to tell her and told her anyway because someone had to, that the seam he had gone to look at had let go, without the courtesy of warning that seams sometimes gave. No settling groan beforehand, no trickle of pebbles to announce what was coming, only a sound like the mountain clearing its throat once, and then a silence, with 4 other men's names buried inside it, along with his own. They found what they found 3 days later, when the loose rock had stopped moving enough to be trusted, and what they found was not enough to require a large box. She was told the date twice, as though the men doing the telling did not trust her to hold it the first time, and she held it anyway, turning it over afterward the way she turned over stones on the ridge. The 9th of October, a Thursday, the eggs and the unmended coat and the kettle just beginning to sing, because a date held hard enough becomes a kind of ground a person can stand on when there is no other ground left, and she would need, in the weeks that followed, to have stood somewhere. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house after a death that has produced no body large enough to bury, and it is not the quiet of mourning so much as the quiet of arithmetic, of grown men and women moving through rooms with the careful, lowered voices of people, totaling a column of figures they do not want anyone to hear them total. Within a week, the surveyor's tools had been sorted into what would be sold and what would be kept, his boots given to a freighter's boy whose feet were near enough the size to make the waste of good leather seem sinful, his papers, the maps, the notebooks thick with his slanted pencil observations of dip and strike and timber rot, boxed and set aside with the particular tenderness people reserve for things they do not yet know whether to burn or to keep. She was permitted to keep the notebooks. She asked for nothing else, and was given, along with them, the marking hammer, which nobody else in the house had any use for, and which therefore did not need discussing. The arrangements for her were made with the same brisk competence, in the same lowered voices, over the same kitchen table where the eggs had gone hard that Thursday morning and never been finished. She would go to her aunt, her mother's sister, a woman she had met perhaps 4 times in her life, each time at a funeral, which she would only later understand was not a coincidence, but a kind of family habit. And she would go promptly, before the season turned and the roads worsened, because a girl of 17 could not be left in a boarding house on a dead man's unpaid credit indefinitely. Someone said this last part kindly enough. Someone always says the hard things kindly enough. Her aunt's house, when she reached it after 4 days by wagon and rail, smelled of lye soap and hot iron, and nothing else, no dust, no leather, no rock. A smell so scrubbed of her father's world that she understood, before a single word of welcome had been spoken to her, that she had crossed into a different country entirely. Her aunt met her at the door with a ledger already half open on the hall table, not out of unkindness, she would come to understand, but out of habit, the way another woman might have met her with a shawl or a cup of tea. Her aunt's comfort, such as it was, took the form of sums. Board would be so much, schooling, if there was to be any more of it, so much again. The girl's own dead mother's small annuity, what remained of it, would be applied against these figures, and the difference, whatever it came to, would need to be made up in labor around the house, in mending and washing and the tending of the younger children, until such time as other arrangements presented themselves. Her aunt said all of this without once raising her eyes from the column of numbers, and it would be some months yet before Ruth understood that this, the numbers, the not looking up, was the coldest weather she would ever have to walk through, colder by far than any ridge in November. The Tuesday came the way all the aunt's decisions came, without weather in it, without any sign that the calendar had chosen a day of particular consequence. It was the 14th of the month. Ruth would remember that number the way she remembered depths and bearings, because numbers were the only thing her aunt had ever given her freely, and she had learned to hold on to them. She was called into the front room after the breakfast dishes were cleared, while the younger children were still at the table finishing their milk, and she noticed that this, too, was deliberate, that she was being spoken to in a room where the ordinary business of the house continued around her, so that whatever was said would seem to belong to the same small register as spilled milk and torn stockings. Her aunt had the ledger closed this time, and beside it a single sheet of paper, and beside that a small stack of coin and bills that she had already counted, because her aunt did not care to count in front of people any more than she cared to be seen doing sums twice. $9, her aunt said, which is the balance owing to you after board, and the schooling, and the sum your mother left, all reckoned to this date. She did not say the date. She did not need to. The paper said it for her, in a clerk's careful hand, and beneath the sum was a line for a signature, and beneath that a line already signed, her uncle's name, and beneath that a blank line waiting. "You'll want to read it before you sign," her aunt said, not unkindly, sliding it across the table the way she might have slid a dish of preserves, "though I expect you'll find it says what I've told you." It said what she'd told her. It said that upon receipt of the sum specified, Ruth Calloway, of no further relation by dependency, released the family of any and all further obligation toward her keep, education, or welfare. It did not say where she was to go. It did not ask. She signed it. Her hand did not shake, which surprised her at the time and shamed her a little afterward, though she could never say exactly why. Her aunt folded the paper along a crease already pressed into it, as though she had folded it once before to be sure it would fold true, and set it in the ledger, where it would live from that morning forward, as a closed account, a debt discharged, a column that need never be added to again. "You were no trouble," her aunt said, which was, Ruth understood only years later, the truest kindness the woman had it in her to offer, and perhaps the only one. Ruth took the $9 in a small drawstring purse that had been her mother's, and went up to the room she had shared with two cousins, and began, with the same unhurried attention her father had taught her to give to rock, to decide what a person could carry and what she would have to leave behind forever. She laid it all out on the quilt first, the way her father had taught her to lay out core samples before deciding which ones mattered. Everything visible at once, nothing hidden in a fold or a pocket where its weight could surprise her later. 2 dresses, one for wear and one for wash. A shawl gone thin at the elbows. Stockings darned so many times the darning had become the fabric itself. A tin cup, a folding knife with a bone handle that had been her mother's father's, the only object in the room that had crossed an ocean before it crossed a continent. The drawstring purse with $9 inside it counted twice more, though the sum had not changed and would not change no matter how many times her fingers moved over the coins. And the hammer. It went in last, wrapped in the wash dress so the iron would not bruise the tin, or the tin scar the iron, though she suspected iron feared very little in this world. She held it a moment before she wrapped it, turned it so the window light ran along the flat of the head where her father's hand had worn a shine into the steel over 11 years of striking rock, and she noted, the way he had taught her to note things, that the shine was already beginning to dull, that iron left idle even a few weeks starts to forget the hand that used it, and that she would have to strike something with it soon or lose that shine forever. The satchel, filled, weighed perhaps 11 pounds. She lifted it twice to be certain, once with her right arm and once with her left, because her father had always said, a load worth carrying far should be a load a person could carry with either arm, evenly, without favoring one side, until the shoulder gave out from the favoring. 11 pounds, $9, 2 dresses, 1 knife, 1 cup, 1 hammer. She stood in the doorway of the room that had never quite been hers and looked at it the way she had learned to look at a rock face before deciding where a seam was likely to run, not with sentiment, but with attention, and then she went down the stairs and out the door, and did not look back at the house, because there was nothing in it that belonged to her anymore. And looking back at a thing that is no longer yours was, her father had told her once, the surest way to trip on the thing in front of you. The road out of town ran west before it bent north toward the high country, and she took it on foot in the cool part of the morning while the dew was still silvering the wheel ruts, with the satchel riding easy against her hip, and the sun not yet high enough to punish her for walking, and somewhere behind her, though she did not turn to mark it, the ledger her aunt had closed sat quiet in its drawer, a debt discharged, a column that need never be added to again. The road climbed for 3 days, and each day the country grew less forgiving of anyone who did not respect it. The grass thinned first, then the trees gave up altogether, until she was walking through a landscape of rust-colored rock and pale scrub that seemed to have been left out in the sun so long it had forgotten how to be any other color. The heat did not arrive gradually. It sat down on the land each morning around 9 o'clock and did not rise again until the light itself began to fail, and in between there was only the dry hiss of wind, moving dust from one place to another, never depositing it, never finishing the job, the way a man might shuffle papers on a desk to look busy. She walked in the cool hours and rested in the punishing ones, tucked into whatever shade a boulder or a wash offered, and she rationed her water the way her father had taught her to ration anything that could not be replaced on demand, not by thirst, but by distance remaining. By the second night her boots had taken on the particular red dust of the high country, a color that did not wash out, that she would find in the seams of her clothes for months afterward, evidence of ground covered. She saw a hawk take something small from the scrub on the third morning and did not flinch from it, because her father had also taught her that the desert kept its books balanced in ways town ledgers never did, without apology and without cruelty either. The ridge town, when it finally showed itself, announced itself first as a smell, wood smoke, mule sweat, the metallic tang of a blacksmith's forge, before it announced itself as a shape, a scatter of gray buildings pressed against the base of a mountain that rose behind them like something that had simply always been there and had no interest in the people at its feet. She took a room over a feed store for 50 cents a night and spent her first evening listening, because listening cost nothing, and her father had told her a stranger, who talked before he listened, generally left town poorer for it. It was in the feed store, over sacks of grain and a lantern turned low, that she heard it first, not as her aunt's family had once told it, a cautionary tale meant to quiet a curious child, but as something the town itself seemed to hold at arm's length, half believed and half ashamed of believing. 5 men had gone up the ridge in the spring of 1871 and had not come down, and the mountain, the old man behind the counter said without quite meeting her eyes, did not give back what it decided to keep. She asked the old man behind the counter which company had worked the ridge that spring, and he shrugged in the particular way of a man who has decided a question is not worth the breath it costs to answer, and told her the claims office would know better than his memory, which he said had gone soft with the years, the way meat goes soft when it hangs too long in damp air. So in the morning she walked the length of the town's one real street to the claims office, a narrow building with a tin roof that ticked and popped as the sun climbed it, and she asked the clerk there, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a manner of speaking that suggested he found most questions beneath him, about the 5 men and the ridge and the spring of 1871. He looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at a mule he suspects of lameness, and then he told her, with the patience one might extend to a child asking after a story rather than a fact, that plenty of fool prospectors had wandered up that ridge over plenty of years, and plenty of them had never wandered back down, and that this was simply what the mountain did to men who mistook hope for a survey. He did not offer a ledger. He did not offer a name. When she asked whether any record existed of who had held the claim that season, he told her the records for those years had been lost to a fire, though he said it in a voice that did not sound like a man, recalling a fire so much as a man reciting a sentence he had said before. She thanked him and left, and behind her she heard him say something low to the man beside him, and though she did not catch every word, she caught enough, girl, ghosts, waste of a morning, to understand that she had just become, in the space of one conversation, the kind of curiosity a town keeps at arm's length and laughs about after she has gone. She did not mind it as much as she might have. Her father had taught her that the men least interested in a question were often the men who had the most reason not to ask it themselves, and she carried that thought back to the feed store the way she carried her canteen, something small and useful she meant to keep close. It was the old man behind the counter, later that evening, who told her, quietly, almost as an apology for the clerk's manner, that if she truly meant to go looking, she ought to talk to no one else in town about it, because there were families on the ridge who did not care to be reminded of 1871, and families on the ridge, he said, had long memories, and longer reaches. She asked him which families. He only shook his head and turned the lantern down another notch, and outside the window the mountain sat black and patient against a sky gone the color of a bruise. She did not ask again. She had learned that much from the old man's lantern turned low, and from the way his voice had dropped even though the store was empty. Instead, she found work the way a person finds water in that country, by going where it was likely to be and asking plainly, without pride, and by the end of the week she had it, $2 for mending fence line on a spread that ran along the lower slope, and after that a few days hauling feed for a rancher who did not care where a girl had come from so long as she did not shirk the lifting. It was hard work and it paid little, but it put her within sight of the ridge, and that was worth more to her than the coin. She went to look at the shaft on the third evening, when the light was long and gold, and the crew had gone down for supper. She did not go near it. She had learned that lesson too, from the clerk's face and the old man's caution, and so she stood at a distance, on a shoulder of rock across the draw, and looked at it the way her father had taught her to look at anything that mattered, slowly, and more than once. The entrance had been sealed with timber and rubble, the way a played-out shaft is sealed, or the way a dangerous one is, and from where she stood it looked ordinary enough, a gray scar on a gray slope, the kind of thing a person's eye slides past without catching, but her eye did not slide past it. She noticed that the timber bracing the collapse was not weathered evenly, that one side of it had silvered and cracked the way old wood does under 20 years of sun, and the other side had not, as though it had been cut and set later, or set in shade, or set by a different hand entirely. She noticed, too, that the rubble fanning out below the entrance did not scatter the way rubble falls when a roof gives way on its own. It lay too neatly, in a curve that followed the slope rather than the collapse, as though someone had shoveled it into place after the fact, rather than let the mountain drop it where it would. She sat with that a long while, until the light went from gold to gray, and the cold came down off the peak, the way it always did, once the sun quit the ridge. She did not have words yet for what she was seeing, only the old unease her father used to get in his jaw when a shaft told him one story on the surface and another underneath, and she found herself reaching for the hammer at her belt without meaning to, the way another person might reach for a hand to hold. In the morning, she came back with the county survey papers she had copied by hand at the land office, the ink still faint from her own careful transcription, and she laid them flat across a rock shelf where the light fell clean and even. Her father had taught her to read a strata line the way another person reads handwriting, each seam and shale band a letter in a longer word, and she went to work now the way she had watched him work 100 times, crouched low with her chin near the rock, tracing the exposed layers with 2 fingers without quite touching them. The company records described the shaft running east by 11 degrees north, cut along a dip that matched the natural grain of the mountain, the kind of angle a sensible foreman chose because the rock wanted to be cut that way, and fighting it cost time and timber both. But the collapse in front of her did not sit on that line. It canted a full 7 degrees off the recorded pitch, maybe 8, enough that no honest roof fall would have produced it, because a roof falls along the weakness already in the stone, not across it. She sat back on her heels and looked at the numbers again, and then at the rock, and then at the numbers, the way her father used to, when a sum would not come right, and he refused to blame the arithmetic before he had blamed himself twice over. She did not blame herself. She trusted the reading. Whatever had happened here, the mountain had been cut against its own grain, forced rather than allowed, and men did not force a shaft closed for economy. Economy took the easy angle. Force took the angle that would hold weight exactly where someone wanted weight to sit, packed hard and permanent, no seam left for water or time to work loose. She thought of the rubble again, the too neat curve of it, and felt the 2 facts settle against each other, like a hasp finding its catch. She took out the small ledger book she had bought for 11 cents in town and wrote the discrepancy down in her father's shorthand, the degree marks, the date, the weather, because he had taught her that an observation without a date was just a rumor a man told himself later. Then she sat very still, listening to the wind work through the pines below the ridge, and let herself ask the question she had been circling since she first saw the seam of newer timber the day before. If the shaft had not fallen on its own, then someone had stood exactly where she now stood, 20 years passed, and decided that whatever lay behind that wall of rock was worth more sealed than sold. She looked up at the sky, judged perhaps 2 hours of good light left, and began working her way along the collapse line, searching for the place where a man with tools, and not a mountain with time, had done the closing. She moved along the collapse line the way her father had taught her to move along any rock face she did not yet trust, weight low, eyes reading the stone in strips rather than all at once, because a man who tried to see everything at the same moment usually saw nothing at all. The light was going flat and gold, the particular gold that came only in the 2 hours before a mountain evening, and she used it deliberately, tilting her head so that any mark cut into the rock would throw its own small shadow and declare itself. 40 feet from the sealed entrance, where no survey map she had studied in the county office showed any working at all, she found the outcrop. It was granite, weathered gray-brown, unremarkable to any eye passing quickly, which was precisely why it had waited 20 years to be noticed. But the surface was not entirely weathered. Across its face ran a series of shallow gouges, each one perhaps 4 inches long, cut at the same angle, spaced with a regularity that no frost crack or falling stone had ever produced. She had seen rock split by weather her whole life, the random spiderwork of it, the way nature never repeated an angle twice, because nature was not trying to say anything. These marks were trying to say something. They ran in 3 short groups, a pause, then 2 more, like a man counting something aloud, and marking the count so he would not lose his place. She pressed her fingers into the nearest gouge and felt the sharp, unrounded edge that only fresh steel against stone could leave, an edge that decades of rain should have softened into a shallow dish, and had not, because something had sealed the outcrop from the worst of the weather almost as soon as it was cut. She thought of every survey chisel her father had owned, the particular bite of each one, and she understood, with the flat certainty of someone reading a signature, rather than guessing at one, that this was not a prospector's blaze marking a claim boundary. A claim blaze was a single deep strike, unmistakable, meant to be seen from a distance. This was smaller, quieter, meant to be found only by someone who was looking for it and knew what looking meant. She counted the groups again, 3, then 2. Not a boundary mark, a tally. The wind had dropped, the way it did sometimes, just before the light failed entirely, and in the stillness she heard nothing but her own breathing and the small, patient tick of the mountain cooling around her. She took out the ledger book and copied the pattern exactly as it lay, the spacing, the depth, the angle of each cut against the grain of the stone, because her father had always said, a mark meant nothing until it was recorded the same careful way twice, once by the hand that made it, and once by the hand that found it. Then she stood, brushed the granite dust from her palms, and looked back toward the sealed entrance, with the unsettled feeling of a woman who has just realized a room has more doors in it than she had first been told. She moved along the rock face the way her father had taught her to move along a wall she did not yet trust, one hand always touching stone, her weight never fully committed to a single foot until the ground had proven itself. 5 paces on, she found another tally, 3 strikes and 2, cut at the same depth, the same angle, and she understood then that the marks were not a single message left once, but a trail left deliberately, the way a man leaves sign for another man he expects to follow him and does not trust to remember the way alone. She followed it the way she would follow a seam of ore through broken country, not by sight alone but by feel, running her fingers along the cold granite until they caught on the next shallow cut, and then the next, working her way along the base of the ridge to a place where the rock folded back on itself and the light did not reach at all. There the rubble changed. It was not the rubble of a mountain giving way under its own weight, the kind she had grown up reading in the tumbled talus below her father's cuts, stone falling loose-jawed and careless, largest pieces at the bottom, smaller, riding above them where gravity had sorted them over years of settling. This rubble was stacked, not neatly, not so a passerby would notice, but stacked all the same, larger stones wedged deliberately against smaller ones, a seam of packed shale, driven in behind them like mortar, the whole arrangement built to look like collapse while behaving like construction. She had seen her father shore up a failing drift with exactly this kind of patient, ugly, effective work, stone laid to bear weight rather than simply to fill space. She stood very still. Somewhere above her, a nighthawk called once and was answered by nothing. She reached out and touched the topmost stone, and it did not shift under her palm, the way loose rubble shifts, did not grind or settle, but held, solid as a wall, raised on purpose by hands that meant it to last. She thought of the tally marks leading her here, 3 strikes and 2, and understood them suddenly not as a boundary and not as a warning, but as a count, 5 groups in all, though she had not yet let herself finish that arithmetic all the way to its end. She took the ledger book out again, with fingers that were no longer entirely steady, and began to sketch the opening as it lay before her, the false slope of it, the seam where packed shale met honest stone, because her father had also told her that a lie in the rock always left a line where it joined the truth, if a person was patient enough and careful enough to find it. The seam ran waist-high, no wider than a coffin turned sideways, and she spent the better part of an hour clearing it with her hands and a flat rock used as a shovel, working the way her father had taught her to work, stone that did not want to be moved, not against it, but with it, finding the grain of the rubble the way a man reads the grain of wood, and letting each piece come free in the direction it already wanted to go. By the time she had cleared enough to slip through, her palms were raw and her sleeves were dark with sweat gone cold in the evening air, and the light outside had thinned to the color of ash. She lit the lantern with hands that fumbled twice at the match before the flame caught, and she held it before her like something that might be taken from her, and she went in. The cold inside was not the cold of evening. It was older than that, a cold that had been sitting undisturbed since before she was born, since before her father was born, and it came against her skin, all at once, the way water comes against a person stepping into a river. The smell reached her a moment after the cold did. Dust, yes, dry and mineral and faint, but beneath it, something else, something with weight to it, a smell of rot gone past rot, into a kind of stillness, the smell of a thing that had finished happening a long time ago and simply remained. She moved the lantern ahead of her in small arcs, low and then high, the way her father had shown her to read a wall a man could not see the whole of at once. The passage narrowed further, then opened, then narrowed again, timber sets, leaning at angles, that told her which way the ground had shifted and when, though she did not let herself linger on the arithmetic of it. She noticed she had stopped breathing only when her chest ached for it, and she let the air out slow, through her nose, so that the sound of it would not fill the space the way a gasp would. The lantern light found old boot prints pressed into a floor of settled dust so fine it held them still after 23 years, sharp-edged, undisturbed, as though the men who left them had only just stepped out of frame. She crouched and studied them without touching them, the way her father had studied prints in wet clay, at a claim boundary once, reading direction and weight, and the manner of a man's walking from the depth of his heel. Further in, the passage bent, and beyond the bend the dark thickened in a way that made the lantern's reach seem smaller than it had a moment before, as if the tunnel itself were leaning close to see what she would do next. She held the light higher. Somewhere ahead, past the limit of what the flame could show her, she heard, or thought she heard, the faint, patient drip of water finding its way down through 23 years of stone. The drip came again, closer this time, or perhaps only louder in the stillness, and she followed the sound with her eyes rather than her feet, unwilling yet to trust the footing beyond the bend. The lantern's brass had gone warm in her hand, and she shifted it to the other, flexing fingers that had stiffened from the cold that lived down here regardless of season, a cold that did not care what month it was on the surface. She moved forward 3 steps, no more, and stopped where a support timber crossed the tunnel roof at shoulder height, and it was this timber that made her stop breathing again, though this time she noticed it at once, and did not wait for her chest to remind her. The wood was old, silvered with age, soft at the grain the way pine goes when it has sat in damp dark for decades, but the cut at its base, the notch where it had been set into the stone shoulder to bear the roof's weight, still held its shape, and in that shape she saw the mark. 3 strokes, angled, the middle one deeper than the outer 2. The same signature she had traced with her fingertip on the collapsed portal above, the same rhythm her father had shown her years before on timber pulled from a played-out shaft near the county line, back when she was young enough to think it was only a game he played with her, guess the hand, guess the man. She lifted the lantern to the next support, and the next, moving down the line of them the way her father had once moved down a row of fence posts, checking each for rot, methodical, unhurried, despite the cold pressing against her back. Every timber bore it. The same hand, the same tool, the same 3 strokes cut into wood that had not seen daylight since before she was born. This was not the collapse the town spoke of, over supper tables and porch rails, the one they pointed to on the Ridge Road, and called cursed, and let the subject die there. That collapse was elsewhere, shallower, a story told to keep children from wandering. This shaft ran deeper into the mountain than any account she had heard, and it had been built, braced, timbered, worked, by someone who knew what he was doing and meant for it to last, which meant it had not failed on its own. She stood very still with that thought, the lantern trembling slightly though her hand did not, and somewhere beyond the reach of the flame, the water kept dripping, patient as it had been for 23 years, patient as it seemed prepared to be for 23 more, waiting, the way stone waits, for someone willing to listen long enough to hear what it had been trying to say. She moved the lantern along the timberline the way her father had taught her to move it, not sweeping, but settling, letting the light rest in one place long enough for the eye to find what haste would miss. It was the settling that found it, a shape too regular for the mountain, wedged behind a brace post at shoulder height, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and dark with age, tied with a cord that crumbled to threads the moment her fingers closed on it. She worked it free with the patience the rock had taught her, because rushing a thing wedged in timber only seated it deeper, and because some part of her already understood that whatever this was, it had waited 23 years and would not forgive being torn. Inside the oilcloth, a tin box, the kind used for storing matches or fine tools, its seams gone rust black but whole. The lid resisted, swollen shut by decades of damp, and she set it against her knee and worked the edge with her father's own knife until it gave with a small tired sound, like a held breath finally let go. Paper, not loose sheets, but a bound ledger, its cover softened to felt, its pages the color of weak tea and brittle at the corners where her thumb tested them. She did not open it fully there in the dripping dark. Some instinct, the same one that had kept her hand steady, told her this was not a thing to read standing in mud with a failing lantern. But she turned enough pages to see the handwriting, cramped and careful, columns of figures and dates. October the 9th, October the 11th, October the 14th, 1871. And beneath the dates, words that were not figures at all. Struck vein this morning, wide as a man's arm, richer than anything above the fork. And 2 days later, in the same hand, tighter now, hurried. Told no one but the 4, agreed to say nothing until claim is filed proper. She knelt there a long moment with the ledger open across her knees, the lantern guttering, the cold water still finding its patient way down the rock behind her, and she understood with a clarity that felt almost like her father's voice in her ear that she was holding the reason 5 men had gone into this mountain and none had come out. Not a collapse born of bad luck or bad timber. A silence, deliberately made. She closed the ledger, wrapped it again in what remained of the oilcloth, and held it against her chest, the way a person holds something that has finally been allowed to speak after 23 years of being told to keep still. She did not climb out right away. She sat with the ledger a while longer, the lantern turned low to spare the oil, and let her mind do the work her father had trained it to do, since she was small enough to sit on a claims office counter swinging her feet. He had taught her that figures alone lied by omission, and that the truth of a mine was never in one column, but in the space between 2. She thought of the timber orders she had seen weeks before in the claims office, the ones the clerk had let her copy out of boredom, more than kindness. Dates, board feet, freight charges billed against the company's account. She had not understood, then, why a shaft reported abandoned in early November of that year had drawn a fresh order of 6x6 timbers on the 22nd of October, delivered by wagon from the mill at the fork. Now, kneeling in the cold, with the ledger's dates laid alongside that memory, the way her father had once laid 2 survey lines across a disputed boundary, she saw the shape of it plain. The vein had been struck on the 9th. The men had sworn silence on the 11th. And on the 22nd, new timber had gone in, not to shore up a failing shaft, but to keep a good one standing long enough to be worked quietly, without 4 extra names on the claim. Then, sometime after the 14th, no more orders, no more wagons from the mill. Only, weeks later, the collapse the town had grieved, and then forgotten, filed away as one more sorrow the mountain was owed. She understood, the way her father had taught her to understand a fault line before it moved, that a shaft resupplied does not fail by accident soon after. A man who spends good lumber shoring a hole does not let it cave through carelessness. Something had been decided between the 22nd of October and whatever cold morning the ridge went quiet, a decision made by someone who could order timber and could just as easily order it stopped. She sat with that a long while, the water still finding its way down the rock behind her, patient as it had been for 23 years, and she felt something harden in her chest that was not anger exactly, not yet, but the first cold outline of it, the shape a fact takes right before it becomes a reckoning. The name on the mill order was not a stranger's name. She had seen it before, painted in gold on the window of the assay office, carved into the cornerstone of the bank, spoken with a particular reverence by the woman who ran the boarding house whenever the family's carriage passed on the main street. It was the name that had given the town its schoolhouse and its water rights, the name printed at the top of half the paper currency that changed hands in the saloons, the name that had, by long habit, come to stand in for the ridge itself, as though the mountain and the family that had first staked it were one and the same thing. She had heard it spoken with gratitude her whole short time in that country, and now she turned it over in her mind and heard it differently, the way a word can change its shape entirely once you know what it was used to cover. She understood what it would mean to say this aloud. The family's name was on the church pews and the hospital ward and the school teacher's salary, and to speak against it was not like speaking against some passing prospector who could be run off with a look. It was to speak against the town's own idea of itself, against the comfortable arrangement by which people who had never asked hard questions were permitted to go on not asking them. She thought of the sheriff who had smiled at her kindly and told her the ridge kept its own counsel. She thought of the boarding house woman's soft, admiring voice. She thought, too, of 5 men who had gone under the rock in the cold dark of some morning nobody had troubled to record, men with families of their own once, men reduced now to a paragraph of town grief, and a mountain that had, until this week, refused to give them back. She was 17 years old, with $9 long since spent, a canvas satchel gone thin at the seams, and a hammer in her belt that had never yet been wrong about what the rock was telling her. She had no standing in this town beyond what her labor had bought her, and she understood, sitting there with the water still ticking down the stone, that what she was about to do could cost her all of it. The roof, the work, the fragile foothold she had built, one measured week at a time. She looked at the ledger pages once more, at the dates, at the timber order, at the silence after the 14th, and let the fact settle into her, the way her father had taught her to let a fault settle before deciding whether to trust the ground above it. She did not go to the sheriff, and she did not go to the newspaper man who kept his little press behind glass on the main street, because she had learned by then that paper alone did not move men who owned the paper mill. She went instead to the claims clerk, the one who had stamped her application weeks before, with an ink pad gone dry at the edges, the one who had asked no questions when a girl with a hammer in her belt had filed on a ridge nobody else wanted. She found him at his desk past closing, the lamp turned low to save the oil, and she set the ledger down in front of him without a word, opening it to the 14th of October and letting him read it in his own time, the way her father had always let a man come to a conclusion, rather than dragging him to it. He read slowly, his lips moving faintly over the numbers, and when he reached the timber order that was never filled, he stopped and looked up at her, with an expression she had not expected, not suspicion, not the careful blankness of a man protecting his position, but something rawer, older, a grief that seemed to have been waiting a long time for permission to surface. He said that his own uncle had worked that crew before taking sick and staying behind, and that for 22 years he had wondered, in the quiet hours, whether the sickness had been the mercy that saved him or only a different kind of theft. He turned the pages further, to the assay figures, to the vein widths recorded in a hand, growing tighter and more hurried toward the end, and his careful clerk's fingers trembled slightly against the paper, and he did not try to hide it. He asked her, at last, where the tool marks were, and she showed him the strike patterns she had copied onto a scrap of paper, matched against the drill bits she had found in the company's own supply ledger 3 doors down, bits stamped with a maker's initial that only one outfit in the territory used. He sat with that a long while, and she watched him understand, in the way her father had taught her men understand when the ground finally gives, not all at once, but in a settling, a small collapse of certainty, followed by a stillness. He closed the ledger gently, as though it were something that might still be hurt, and told her that he would keep her secret only long enough for her to decide what to do with it, and that after that he could promise her nothing. She did not sleep that night, though she lay in the narrow bed with the ledger wrapped in oilcloth beneath her pillow, feeling its shape the way a person feels a stone in a boot, impossible to ignore, impossible to walk around. By morning she had decided, not because the fear had left her, but because she understood that fear would never leave on its own, that it would sit with her at breakfast and follow her down every street in that town for the rest of her life, unless she made it answer to something larger than itself. She walked to the claims office at 9 o'clock, when the street was full enough that no one could say later she had done it in shadow. She carried the ledger under her arm, the way her father had once carried his surveying charts, squared against her ribs, and she carried the drill bits in a small tin box, and she carried the tool mark rubbings folded flat inside her sleeve. The clerk who owed her his silence stood near the window when she entered, and he did not stop her, and he did not help her, and she understood that this, too, was its own kind of answer. She set the ledger on the counter in front of the recorder and the 2 men who had come in behind her to file a grazing dispute, and she opened it to the assay page, and she spoke the name of the company that had sealed the shaft in the autumn of 1871, the name every family on the ridge still said with a certain deference, as though it were a weather system rather than a business. She said it plainly, without raising her voice, the way her father had taught her to read a strike face, without embellishment, because embellishment was for men who were not certain of the ground beneath them. The room went the particular kind of quiet that comes before either violence or shame, and she did not know yet which it would be. She laid the drill bits beside the ledger and the rubbings beside the bits, and she said that the marks matched, and that the men who died had not vanished, and that the ground did not forget what was done to it, even when men did. She heard, somewhere behind her, a chair scrape back, slow and deliberate, and she did not turn to see who had risen, because she understood that whatever came next, there was no retrieving the words already spoken, no folding the ledger closed again and pretending she had never opened it. The man who had risen was the son, not the father, and he said nothing at all before he walked out into the gray afternoon, and did not come back to the meeting, and within the week the elder of the family had left the ridge altogether for the county seat, on business that everyone understood was not business. That was how it went, in the end. Not with shouting, not with any of the reckoning the dime novels would have promised, but with a slow draining away of deference, the way water finds the low ground, without announcing that it is moving at all. The bank that had carried the family's paper for 11 years called it due in March. The claims office, which had for 2 decades filed the family's paperwork first and asked its questions after, began asking its questions first. By the time the frost broke that year, the name that had once been spoken with a certain weight on the ridge was spoken instead the way men speak of a thing that has gone bad in the cellar, quietly and with the door shut. She did not attend any of it, did not sit in on the hearings or the depositions, because she had understood from the first hour, standing over the ledger with the lamp burning low, that her part of the work was already finished, and that what came after belonged to lawyers and county clerks and men whose trade was untangling other men's ruin. Her trade was the ground. She filed the claim herself, in the spring, under the 5 names the ledger had given back to her. Not her own name first, though the clerk assumed it would be, and she corrected him without heat, the way her father had once corrected a hand who'd read a grade wrong. She timbered the shaft the way he had shown her, sighting the angle before she cut, testing each set with the flat of her palm before she trusted it with her weight, going slower than any crew would have tolerated, because slow was the only speed the mountain had ever rewarded. She cleared the rubble by lamplight and by daylight both, 1 cart at a time, through a summer that baked the ridge white and a fall that turned it the color of rust, until the shaft, that had swallowed 5 men in 1871, stood open again, braced and true, breathing cold air up into the sun for the first time in 22 years. She named it before the first ore cart ever came up loaded, the 5 Brothers, painted in black letters on a plank nailed above the new headframe, and the men in town who had spent a year deciding whether to speak to her again read it and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that the vein itself did not already answer. It ran deep and it ran rich, deeper and richer than the family who had sealed it had ever dared to work openly, and by the 2nd year she was paying 6 men a fair wage to bring it up, and by the 4th she was paying 20, and the ridge that had once dismissed a girl chasing ghosts had quietly stopped calling her that, the way a place will stop repeating a joke once the joke has bought half its winter coal. She kept an office in town by then, small and plain, a desk and a stove, and a window facing the ridge so she could watch the weather move across it while she worked the ledgers, her own ledgers now, columns she balanced herself, to the dollar, the way she had once been counted out to the dollar on a Tuesday morning, with no malice in it at all. On the wall behind the desk, where another owner might have hung a rifle or a framed assay report, she hung her father's marking hammer, the handle worn smooth in the place a hand rests, the iron head still true. Visitors sometimes asked if it was a keepsake. She told them it was a tool, and that she used it still, and both things were true. She did not think of the 5 men often, not in the sharp way grief works on the newly bereaved, but in the slower way the ground itself seemed to think of them, patiently, without hurry, keeping their account the whole while men above tried to close it. That was the thing she came to understand, standing at her window some evenings with the ledger closed and the lamp turned low, that dirt and rock do not forget the way people do. Do not accept a signature in place of the truth. Do not let a shaft stay sealed simply because someone with money wished it so. The mountain had held the men's claim honest for 22 years, waiting for someone patient enough to read what it was still saying. She turned the lamp down and looked out at the dark shape of the ridge against the stars, and did not feel the need to say anything more about it, to herself or to anyone, because the mountain already had.